The early autumn sun hung low over the green river, casting long shadows across the rippling water and the dense forest lining its banks. The air was crisp, with a biting chill that hinted at the coming winter, and the steady hum of cicadas had given way to the occasional call of a lone crow. It was a day like any other for the riverfront campers, families, and travelers who sought refuge in the quiet wilderness, unaware of the dark undertones whispered by the river's currents. Sergeant Harold Kim stood at the edge of the water, his worn leather boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The veteran's eyes, a steely shade of gray, scanned the dense tree line where the memorial clearing lay hidden, a modest monument dedicated to soldiers lost overseas. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the silver star pinned to his jacket, a symbol of valor that weighed heavily on his chest, both physically and emotionally. This was supposed to be a simple visit, a quiet moment of remembrance away from the noise of the city and the ghosts of war that haunted his every step. For Harold, the memorial was more than just stone and metal. It was a tether to the past, a place where he could speak to comrades long gone and to the version of himself that had survived battlefields far away. But something was off that day. The usual tranquility felt brittle, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Harold pulled the dog tags from beneath his shirt, the familiar coldness grounding him. One tag bore his name, the other was etched with a small, nearly faded inscription, a hotline number for veterans struggling with PTSD. The scars of war were etched deep within him, invisible to most, but ever present. He took a slow, measured breath and began the short hike to the clearing. Along the way, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots seemed unnaturally loud, each step echoing his unease. As he reached the memorial, Harold knelt and placed a small, folded photograph beside the stone, an old picture of his squad, smiles frozen in time before the chaos. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, rustling sound. But when Harold turned to look, there was nothing. Only shadows and the quiet. A distant bark of a dog startled him, and for a moment he felt eyes watching from the darkness beyond the clearing. His hand instinctively moved to the small knife strapped to his belt, a remnant of his military days and the battles he wished never to relive. Harold shook his head, telling himself it was just nerves, the weight of old memories mingling with the solitude. But as he stood, ready to leave, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, like a branch snapping underfoot. He froze. From the corner of his eye, movement. Quick, deliberate steps approaching through the underbrush. Harold reached for his phone, only to find it dead. The batteries drained. A cold sweat broke over his forehead. The river was just beyond, its dark waters promising escape or oblivion. And then, before he could react further, rough hands grabbed him from behind. His wrists were bound quickly with zip ties, cold, unyielding. Panic surged, but his military training kept him calm, struggling only enough to assess his attackers. They don't know who they're messing with, Harold thought, muscles tensing for the fight that never came. The last thing he saw before being dragged away was the fading light of the setting sun, swallowed by the thick canopy of the forest. The forest swallowed the sounds of struggle as Sergeant Harold Kim was dragged deeper into the underbrush, the cold zip ties cutting into his wrists, biting reminders that this was no random encounter. His breath came in controlled bursts, every muscle primed for escape, but the rough hands holding him were relentless, pulling him toward a shadowed path he hadn't noticed before. Time warped under the dense canopy. The faint light from the setting sun dimmed quickly, replaced by a chill that seeped into Harold's bones. The muddy ground grew uneven, and the muffled rush of water reached his ears. The kidnappers moved with practiced urgency, their heavy boots crushing leaves and snapping twigs, sounds swallowed almost instantly by the dense wilderness. Harold's mind raced through possibilities. Robbery was the most obvious motive. His medals, his military gear, the dog tags etched with the PTSD hotline number that marked him as vulnerable. But something darker lurked beneath the surface of this violent act, something that gnawed at his instincts. As the group emerged onto the bank of the Green River, The floodwaters lapped hungrily at the rocks and roots. One of the kidnappers pulled a rusted ammo box from a worn backpack and tossed it into the shallow water. Harold's heart sank as he saw his silver star, the very metal pinned to his jacket that day, now resting in the murky riverbed, coated in mud and algae. The leader of the crew barked orders in a low voice, and Harold heard the telltale scrape of a zipper on a large duffel bag. He was shoved forward, forced to kneel beside the river's edge. The man crouched in front of him, voice rough and coated with menace. "You're coming with us. Keep quiet, or you won't live to regret it." Harold's lips tightened. He refused to show fear. Years of combat had honed his resolve, even if his body bore the scars and the shadows of war still whispered in his mind. He scanned his surroundings. There was a narrow crevice carved into the rocky bank, half submerged by the rising water. It was tight, dangerous, but it might be his only chance. Suddenly, a commotion echoed upstream, a dog barking, voices shouting. The kidnappers froze, exchanging nervous glances. The river camps nearby were no secret, but the presence of other people complicated their plans. The leader hissed an order, "Move!" They shoved Harold toward the crevice. His legs scraped against sharp rocks as he was forced forward, water rushing around him. The kidnappers disappeared into the trees as Harold was shoved head first into the narrow passage. Panic bubbled, but Harold fought to control it. The cold water numbed his limbs, and the darkness closed in around him. He tried to shift, to find leverage, but his zip-tied hands kept him pinned. Minutes felt like hours. The river's flow grew louder, the pressure mounting as water surged through the cavern. Harold's lungs burned. He wrenched his head back to catch a glimpse of the outside world, but the crevice swallowed the fading daylight. As the water rose, Harold's mind flickered to memories. His squadmates calling his name in the mud of a distant battlefield, the nights spent staring at a ceiling that held nothing but shadows, the hotline number on his dog tags, meant to be a lifeline for broken soldiers like him. And then, silence. The rising water pressed harder against Harold's body, icy currents swirling in the cramped crevice of the riverbank. His lungs screamed for air, but his training forced him to hold steady, fighting the primal urge to panic. The zip ties bit cruelly into his wrists, restricting every movement. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the darkness, broken only by the harsh pulse of the river's flow and his own ragged breathing. Outside, the kidnappers moved swiftly through the woods, voices fading with every step, swallowed by the night. Their footsteps became a distant memory, leaving Harold alone with the river's cold embrace. Minutes passed, or was it hours, before the water level began to ebb slightly, leaving Harold shivering and gasping for breath. He tried to free his hands, but the plastic ties were fastened tight, mocking his efforts. Desperation mingled with a stubborn resolve. If he was to survive, he'd have to rely on more than strength. He needed luck. Somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of a campfire crackled faintly. He strained his ears, but could barely make out the voices of the campers. The river, once a friend to his quiet pilgrimage, now felt like a merciless trap. Harold's mind wandered back to the day he first earned his silver star. The mission had been a nightmare, a night ambush in hostile territory, smoke and fire painting the sky. He'd acted without hesitation, saving the lives of his unit, but paying a steep personal price. The medal was more than a symbol. It was a reminder of survival against impossible odds. Now, buried beneath layers of silt and water, that same medal seemed to mark the boundary between life and death. Suddenly, a faint light flickered near the entrance to the crevice. Harold's heart surged. Was it a rescue party, or more kidnappers coming to finish the job? He willed his eyes to adjust to the dim glow. A hand appeared, a diver's glove, breaking the water's surface. Harold's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. "Help, please." The gloved hand moved closer, followed by another. A flashlight beam swept over the murky water, illuminating Harold's pale, soaked face. Relief crashed over him, overwhelming the cold and pain. "Hold on, Sergeant Kim," a voice said firmly. "We're here." As the divers worked swiftly to free him, Harold's thoughts were clouded, but clear. He had vanished that day, swallowed by the river and its dark secrets, but fate had not yet claimed him. Above the surface, the Green River flowed quietly, indifferent to the secrets it kept buried beneath. The world above the Green River seemed unchanged. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, birds chirped their evening songs, and the campfires flickered against the gathering dusk. But beneath the surface, the river had revealed a secret long buried, dragging Sergeant Harold Kim back from the edge of oblivion. The forensic divers worked meticulously, their movements careful and deliberate as they freed Harold's tangled, ice-cold body from the narrow crevice. His wrists were still bound with zip ties, a grim testament to the violence he had endured. As they pulled him into the boat, Harold's eyes fluttered open, glassy but aware. Paramedics rushed him to the nearby riverfront clinic, their words calm but urgent. Harold's body was battered and weak, but alive, a miracle many had stopped hoping for after nearly a decade of disappearance. His story was incomplete, a puzzle missing key pieces. Detective Laura Hayes stood in the clinic's sterile hallway, her arms folded tightly over her chest. She'd been assigned to the cold case years ago, but had never given up hope. When the news of the discovery reached her, a mix of excitement and dread washed over her. 9 years of unanswered questions suddenly hung in the balance. "Can he talk?" Laura asked the attending doctor. The physician shook his head grimly. "He's stable for now, but disoriented. Could be hypothermia, trauma, and the PTSD is likely resurfacing in full force." Laura's mind raced. How had Harold survived? Who had taken him, and why was his silver star found in a flooded river cave, a place nearly impossible to reach? Back in his hospital room, Harold lay wrapped in a thin blanket, eyes closed, but mind restless. Flashbacks tugged at his consciousness, the snap of zip ties, the dark crevice, the rushing water. But there was something else, a whisper of faces he couldn't fully see, the faint smell of smoke, and the unshakable feeling that he'd been hunted, not just kidnapped. A nurse entered quietly, checking his IV line. "You're safe now, Sergeant," she said softly. "We're going to take care of you." Harold's fingers twitched involuntarily toward the dog tags around his neck, his lifeline through the darkest moments. The PTSD hotline number etched on the tag had once been a beacon in his despair, but now it felt like a silent scream for justice. Outside, Detective Hayes stared out the window at the river's shimmering surface, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her. This was no simple missing person case. Something sinister lurked beneath the calm exterior of the Green River campsites, and it was up to her to uncover the truth. The river had returned its secret to the surface, but would it reveal the story behind Sergeant Harold Kim's disappearance before it was too late? Detective Laura Hayes sat in the cramped, cluttered office of the county sheriff's department, a fresh file spread open before her. The years-old case of Sergeant Harold Kim had just taken an astonishing turn, and every detail now demanded scrutiny. Photographs of the river cave, the rusted ammo box, and the recovered silver star lay scattered across the desk, alongside reports from the forensic divers. Laura traced her finger along the faded inscription on the dog tag, a hotline number for PTSD. It struck her deeply. Harold was a man who had carried invisible wounds as heavily as the medals he wore. 9 years missing, presumed dead, now alive but silent. She glanced at the photographs of the riverfront campsites taken from the summer of 2000. The area was known for transient campers and, more troubling, rumors of a small but ruthless robbery crew that preyed on isolated visitors. A few locals had whispered about them, violent, secretive, and always disappearing without a trace. Laura's first call was to the Green River Park Rangers. "Have there been any other incidents like this?" she asked. "Nothing on this scale," came the reply. "But the river camps have always been a hot spot for petty crime. No one ever thought it would turn violent." Next, she reached out to Harold's family. His sister Maria Kim answered after several rings, her voice brittle with years of worry. "I never stopped hoping," she said. But when they found his medal, I thought it was over. Laura promised to keep Maria informed. She also knew she had to find out more about the night Harold vanished. Turning to the forensic report, Laura noted the drag marks in the silt near the riverbank. Clear signs that Harold had been moved after being bound. The fact that his remains were found in the flooded cave crevice suggested an attempt to hide the evidence. The pieces didn't fit neatly. Why kidnap a decorated veteran just to leave him for dead? Why take the silver star and dog tags only to discard them in the river? And who were the men responsible? Her thoughts drifted to the PTSD hotline number etched on Harold's dog tag. Could it be a clue left by Harold himself? A silent call for help, etched in steel and rust, waiting to be found. The investigation was only beginning, but Laura felt the weight of the past pressing against her. Every lead was a step closer to uncovering the truth, and perhaps to delivering justice for a man who had already paid too high a price. Outside, the Green River flowed on, indifferent to the secrets it held beneath its surface. Detective Laura Hayes found herself poring over Harold Kim's military records late into the night, searching for anything that might explain why a decorated veteran would become a target. The deeper she dug, the more complex the picture became. Harold's service was exemplary. Tours in dangerous zones, commendations for bravery, and a record unmarred by controversy. But behind the medals was a man haunted by war, wrestling with PTSD that left him isolated and vulnerable. The hotline number etched on his dog tags wasn't just a random addition. It was a desperate plea etched in steel, a lifeline to a world he feared slipping away. Laura's next lead came from an unlikely source, an old war buddy of Harold's, Corporal James "Jimmy" Tran. Contacting Jimmy was difficult. The years and the pain had scattered Harold's circle of friends, but Jimmy agreed to meet. In a dimly lit cafe near the edge of town, Jimmy's hands trembled slightly as he recounted memories of their time together. "Harold wasn't the same when he came back," Jimmy said, voice low. "He had nightmares, flashbacks, but he never stopped trying to do right by his men. That medal meant everything to him, not just for what he did, but for what he survived." Jimmy's eyes darkened. There were things Harold didn't talk about, some shadows from the war that followed him here, people he crossed paths with, some who wanted to silence him. Laura leaned forward. "Do you think his disappearance was connected to those people? Something from his past?" Jimmy hesitated. "Maybe, or maybe it was something closer to home. You know how the river camps attract the wrong crowd. Harold didn't have many friends after the war, but he tried to stay out of trouble. He was careful, but sometimes trouble finds you anyway." Back at the precinct, Laura reviewed reports of criminal activity near the Green River from 1999 to 2001. There were scattered incidents, robberies, assaults, and disappearances, all dismissed as isolated, but patterns began to emerge. A small, violent group had operated along the riverfront, preying on campers and wanderers. Rumors suggested they were involved in drug trafficking and robbery, but no one had connected them to Harold's case. The forensic diver's report added a chilling detail. Harold's wrists had been zip-tied, but no signs of struggle beyond that. He'd been overpowered quickly, perhaps betrayed by trust or caught off guard. Laura's gut told her the answers lay buried not just in the river, but in the shadows of those campsites. She needed to find survivors, witnesses who could shed light on what really happened that night. As the night deepened, the Green River whispered secrets, secrets that would not stay hidden forever. Detective Laura Hayes stood at the edge of the Green River campsites as twilight bled into night. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves hanging heavy. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, eyes scanning the circle of tents, fire pits long cold, and abandoned gear scattered like ghosts of past visitors. She was here chasing shadows, the elusive threads that tied Harold Kim's disappearance to the people who had lived and preyed along this riverfront nearly 2 decades ago. Her contact, a local named Eddie Reynolds, had agreed to meet in secret. Eddie was one of the few who had survived a violent encounter with the robbery crew rumored to have operated here in 2000. His face was weathered, eyes sharp despite his guarded demeanor. "I don't like talking about those days," Eddie said, voice rough. "But you're asking about Harold, right? Kidnapped, bound. Yeah, I heard about that." Laura pressed gently. "What do you know? Who were these men?" Eddie glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "They called themselves the River Rats. Small crew, mean as hell. They'd rob anyone. Campers, fishermen, even other criminals if they got the chance. But Harold, he was different. He wasn't just some easy mark." "Why would they target him?" Laura asked. Eddie sighed. "Money, maybe. Or maybe they thought Harold had something they wanted. That metal, the gear, maybe even secrets from his time in the service. Some say the Rats were working with people who wanted to keep certain things buried. Harold probably got too close." Laura's mind flashed back to the dog tags with the PTSD hotline number, the ammo box in the river cave, and the zip-tied wrists. It painted a picture darker than simple robbery, a targeted, calculated attack. Eddie hesitated. There was one thing strange. The night Harold vanished, there was talk of a deal gone wrong. A fight. Some of the Rats wanted out, but others, they wanted blood. Harold got caught in the middle. "Did anyone see it happen?" Laura asked urgently. "Not clearly," Eddie admitted. "Most were too scared, but there was a kid who ran off that night. They say he disappeared soon after." A lead. Laura's pulse quickened. If she could find that kid, if he was still alive, maybe she could finally untangle the web. As she left the campsites, the river's steady murmur felt like a warning. Somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the mud and water, lay the truth, waiting for someone brave enough to dive deep. Detective Laura Hayes. Hayes stared at the faded photograph in her hand, a grainy image of a teenage boy, eyes wide with fear, standing near the Green River campsites. This was the kid Eddie had mentioned, Marcus Sparrow Lane, rumored to have vanished shortly after the violent night Harold Kim disappeared. Tracking down Marcus had been a long shot, but a tip from a local social worker pointed to a halfway house in a nearby town. Laura drove through the rain-slick streets, anticipation knotting her stomach. Inside the drab building, she found Marcus, now in his late 20s, a shadow of the boy in the photo. His eyes darted nervously as she introduced herself and showed him the Silver Star medal and the dog tags recovered from the river cave. I remember, Harold," Marcus whispered, voice cracking. "That night was chaos. The River Rats, they weren't just thieves, they were dangerous. When things went south, I ran. I thought I'd never look back." Laura leaned forward. "What happened? Tell me everything." Marcus swallowed hard, then began to unravel the night's horrors. The robbery crew had planned to steal from a wealthy camper rumored to be hiding cash and drugs near the river. Harold had stumbled upon them by accident during his memorial visit, maybe recognized one of the men from a past encounter. The plan collapsed into violence. Harold was captured, tied up, and dragged to the river cave. The crew argued about what to do. Some wanted to kill him to silence him. Others hesitated, but in the end, Harold was left to drown in the flooded crevice, his medals tossed aside to cover the crime. Marcus had witnessed it all, but escaped, terrified of retaliation. Laura's mind raced. Marcus's testimony could break the case wide open. But she knew trust wouldn't come easy. Years of fear and trauma had left Marcus wary of authority and silence. "Harold's alive now," Laura said gently. "He needs justice, and you can help make sure the River Rats pay for what they did." Marcus looked away, conflicted. "I want to, but I'm scared. They said they'd come after me if I talked." The shadows of the past loomed large, but the truth, buried for nearly a decade, was finally beginning to surface. Outside, the Green River whispered coldly, as if warning that the reckoning was near. The tension in the room was palpable as Detective Laura Hayes sat across from Marcus Lane and Harold Kim. After months of recovery and therapy, Harold's eyes held a quiet steel that spoke of survival and resolve. Marcus, once a frightened boy, was now prepared to face the ghosts of his past. "The River Rats won't get away with this," Laura promised. "We have enough now to bring them down." Together, they recounted the events of that fateful night, the robbery, the betrayal, and the chilling attempt to erase Harold forever. Marcus's testimony, paired with forensic evidence from the river cave, painted a damning picture of violence and cruelty. Armed with this, Laura coordinated with local law enforcement for a series of raids on the suspected gang members' hideouts. The once shadowy river rats were exposed. Several arrests were made, and stolen items linked to other crimes were recovered. The court case that followed was intense, but Harold's bravery in testifying and Marcus's courage in confronting his fears turned the tide. The perpetrators were convicted of kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. For Harold, the Silver Star reclaimed its true meaning, a symbol not only of valor in war, but of survival and justice. The PTSD hotline number etched on his dog tags became a beacon of hope, reminding him and others that even in the darkest moments, help and healing were possible. As the sun set over the Green River, Harold and Maria stood by the water's edge, the river's gentle flow washing away years of pain and uncertainty. The past had been laid bare, but the future shimmered with promise. Detective Hayes watched from a distance, the weight of the case lifting. The river had kept its secrets for nearly a decade, but justice was short, minute, jolls, like the current beneath the surface, was unstoppable.